Institute. I have a feeling we're going to call it both. Thank you very much for coming. This is the first event of this semester. We expect to have several more. Before I introduce our guests, let me tell you two things about the Institute and also tell you that in a few weeks we will be doing a similar conversation, this time with a former foreign minister from Armenia, talking not just about Armenia but about Scotland. Some of you will figure that out, and the rest of you, it's okay. Come back and we'll tell you why. I want to thank you again for coming. The Institute of Armenian Studies has been around for 9 years. It is one of SC's many multidisciplinary institutes, and we intend, and my name is Salpi Ghazarian, I'm the director. I've now been on the job, I think, 4 weeks. We intend to collaborate. We intend to continue to talk about Armenian issues as part of the global conversation, and I can't think of a better way to start that than to have a representative of the Armenian community in Lebanon talking about the Middle East, perhaps a Middle East with no minorities. I'm very, very grateful that Dr. Laurie Brand has agreed to play Charlie Rose today and moderate, engage in the conversation. As you can imagine, we're going to do this very quickly. The students and the faculty will go back to class, and the rest of you visitors to campus, you're welcome to hang around and visit. Thank you. We're taping this. We will be live streaming it as a test and live streaming all future events as well. Welcome, Dr. Brand. Thank you very much. Dr. Haidostian, thank you. Please.
Well, first of all, I want to express my thanks for being invited to be a part of this, having the chance to be involved in this first event of the season for the Armenian Studies Institute, and also have the opportunity to meet with Dr. Haidostian. This is a great honor for me. There are many, many things that we could talk about today, and clearly the question of the role of the position of minorities in the Middle East, I think for people who've been following Middle East politics, this has been an important issue for a long time. But certainly with the recent events in Syria and Iraq, the onslaught of what's called itself the Islamic State, Daesh in Arabic, the threat that's posed to a number of communities has really, I think, brought to the fore the question of the place of minority communities going forward. What is their future and the reason? So the title of this is extremely apt. I think that one of the things that maybe it's because I'm a social scientist, I wanted to start off with was just the question of how do we think about minorities in general? I think it's important to pose that up front so that when we talk about the question of minorities, that we have kind of a broad sense of what we mean. Because a minority in one area is not necessarily a minority in another area. We often think across the Middle East of Christians as being minority communities sort of in general, but of course we know in the case of Lebanon that we had, at least perhaps in an earlier period, a plurality of Lebanese who were Christians. Also, groups that are minorities in one area may not be a minority in another area. For example, we talk about the position of the Shia in various parts of the Middle East. We think about the Shia in Bahrain and the recent repression of the uprising in Bahrain. The Shia there are extremely marginalized, but they happen to be the majority population if we're thinking only in terms of numbers. So the way that we use the term minority, in Arabic, aqaliyya, which comes from the word qalil, which means few, is one way of thinking about it. But historically, these governments have not liked to use that term with reference to these various groups. The Egyptian government took great offense at one point in people referring to the Copts in Egypt as an aqaliyya. No, we are all one Egyptian people, so they didn't want the term to be used. And so in the case of Lebanon, the term that is used, which would seem perhaps to equate among different groups, is the word ta'ifa. Right? Ta'ifa doesn't have the sense of a small number. It has a sense of a grouping. So I wanted to begin the conversation with Dr. Haidostian, just to get his reactions to that, sort of the notion of what it means, what the word aqaliyya or minority means, perhaps in particular how in Armenian, what the word is it's been used. Is it different in terms of Armenians who are in various parts of the Middle East, Armenians in other parts of the diaspora? And then we'll, after that sort of initial discussion, we'll come to some specifics maybe about what's going on today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks to the Armenian Institute at USC to have organized this. And I'm very glad that this is a very intimate room, a very warm setting. So I hope we can benefit to the best. About minorities now. Well, where can I start? I will not define, but I'll make a few remarks about how I understand minorities. And number one, in my understanding, when we talk about minorities, we're talking about a psychology. Some groups that are few, pokramasnutyun. In Armenian, pokramasnutyun means a small part of the big picture. Often, what we call minorities do not behave, do not think about themselves as minorities. So they live and act as if they're equal to anyone else. So then there's a diffusion, in the majority-minority meanings and so on. So I think one point is a psychology point, and we could unpack this vis-a-vis the current Middle Eastern situation. Which of the groups in the Middle East think about themselves or feel about themselves as being minorities? This is one particular point. The second one, the whole concept of minority has to do with how the bigger numbers behave. The bigger numbers draft their laws, their constitutions, how the bigger numbers, or those we call majority, behave and act with the others. So I think it's a dynamic reality. This whole definition of minorities is dynamic. In the Middle East today, we're reintroducing the topic of minorities, because minorities are not only feeling that they are few in number, but because they're feeling that they will be pushed out. Anyone who doesn't fit a certain program, which is maybe at this point religious, not political, not ethnic, not racial, they're being pushed out of the picture. So that's why we have the topic today. If we continue this kind of a definition of the majority pushing the minority out, and hoping and wishing and working and fighting to just delete them from the existence or the picture and so on. Okay. So that's how I see the whole understanding.
Okay, before we move to talk specifically about what's happening now, one of the things that comes out of what you just said makes me think of the fact that in a number of Middle Eastern governments, long-seated leaders, often not elected, or if elected, only fancifully so, have either implicitly or explicitly made the argument that they are the best defenders of minorities against the majority, whether that's defined in religious terms, whether it's defined in some sort of ethnic terms, or some combination thereof. So in other words, that these generally religious minorities are, they're in effect beholden to them for their safety. So we protect you from a potential onslaught or being overwhelmed by a threatening majority, but in exchange, we expect you to continue to support us as authoritarian leaders. How do you see that kind of bargain, or I don't know whether one wants to call it a social contract or not? It's not quite that, but how do you see that?
I think that in many systems in the world, including political systems, but not necessarily only political, those in power try to create a dependency, a total dependency of their subjects to them in various ways. So they try to convince them that their welfare is dependent on good behavior and the protection of whoever the system is, whatever the system is. This has happened in many countries, obviously, of the Middle East. And that's a wrong picture, obviously, because the basis of human life and the human contract is not laws and constitutions. It's not citizenship. It's not the varieties of laws, of religion and of human rights and personal rights and so on. So you shift the focus from the law to the relationship. So your safety depends on the relationship with so-and-so, whether it's a government or something else. And I think one of the major problems of the Middle East today is that the focus is on the relationship among the groups and the relationships of the leadership and their subjects. So there's a problem in the system. Now, this is not to say, by the way, I don't want to be naive, this is not to say that in democratic countries, governments do not create other forms of dependency. I mean, I think leaders, people who want to rule, are very creative about how to get their subjects be dependent, be grateful. I think that's even the political divisions in the USA, whereby each one shows you that, well, your interests, particular interests, are served if you vote for me and so on, but it's a more democratic way, so it's a more acceptable way. In the Middle Eastern countries, truly, I should say, many governments had supported and created safety havens for minorities, but not for the sake of the minorities, but for the sake of the survival of the system, survival of a regime, survival of a political party. It is also interesting to note in the Middle East that many of the governments were run by minority groups themselves, as you know, in Iraq and Syria, to give two main examples. So it's for the interest of the state, interest of the ruling power. But then minorities, think about them. How are minorities to act? If you're a minority, for example, in one of the countries of the Middle East and you feel endangered, and you have two choices. One choice is to go silent on a number of political issues and to be an obedient subject and then keep doing your thing freely, you just daily life. And your other option is to lose your status, to lose your freedom, to keep the minimum of your identity. So people often in the past few years have had these two unfair choices. Both are unfair, actually, if you think about it, because it's not in the service of the community, of the religious ta'ifa or sect. It's not in the interest of the human being or their personal rights or their civic rights.
Let's take Lebanon as an entree into the present, because one, that's where you're from and that's where you've been living. That's what you know sort of best up close. But also because I think there's been, and we'll turn to Syria and Iraq after we finish with this, but there's been very little attention, I think, to what's been happening in Lebanon. And yet Lebanon is one of the most interesting cases, if we look in the Middle East with this group, these various Tawa'if, the arrangement that was put in place back at the time of independence for how to attempt to balance or bring together, allow for coexistence among different groups. And so I guess I'd like your thoughts on sort of where is Lebanon, how do you see Lebanon now? What do you see as the most important threats, the most important challenges? Do you feel like that Lebanon, given its history, has any particular advantages as it confronts the future? Or is the legacy of the past something which weighs more heavily than any possible advantages they could derive from past experience?
Obviously, I live
huge
in
question, sorry.
Huge question, but I have a number of, I hope, interesting points to raise regarding Lebanon. I think Lebanon is in a very strong position and in a very weak position at the same time, because Lebanon is a pact. Lebanon is based on an agreement among various communities, the 18 religious groupings of the country. Some are very huge, some are very, very small. But the Lebanese independence of 1943 said that, number one, the Christians and the Muslims have to understand that they will coexist in a modern state, in a democratic state. It was an agreement based on two things, and I think this is one of the strengths of Lebanon. Number one, there was the constitution, al-Dustur, the constitution of the country. But second, and I think that's necessary for every country, they had something called mithaq, pact, national pact, something between the lines of the constitution. For example, the constitution talked about the system of the country, but the national pact was this understanding that the president has to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim, and so on. This is not a matter of the constitution, it's a matter of the national pact. And I think in every country we need these two things. We need the constitution, the dry constitution, and then this other thing, which is a set of values, set of understandings, with which people abide. And this is how Lebanon was constructed. This was the strength of Lebanon. Probably it was a genius of bringing all these varieties of tiny minorities. And in fact, in Lebanon, there's not one group that could claim that it is a majority. And that's the strength of Lebanon. There are more minors, less minors, minorist, minor, I mean, anyone in English here writing dictionaries and so on. But the whole Lebanese situation of minorities has been interesting and a point of strength. But as you can imagine, before I say it, it's also one of the major weaknesses of Lebanon, because if it's based on a balance of too many points, now, oops, any development from outside Lebanon that impacts one or two minorities will impact the whole balance in the country. So Lebanon has been strong in that sense. Lebanon is today weak because with the Shia community, they are impacted by what happens in Iran and Iraq and Bahrain, in Syria. With the Sunni Lebanese, they're impacted by what happened in what was called the Arab Revolution, Spring, or something of that sort, which is, you know, we can ask me about it if you're interested. But anyway, we're in the autumn now, right? We're starting fall season. So everyone is impacted. The Armenians in Lebanon are impacted every time an Armenian street is bombed in Aleppo. The Syriacs are impacted every time something happens in Qamishli in Syria. The Kurds of Lebanon are influenced by what happens in northern Iraq, on the border of Turkey, now between Aleppo and Kilis in Turkey. So you have all these minorities that came together to form Lebanon. It's a strength, wow, wonderful experiment, but then all are minorities and weak, therefore any movement around them shook them, and has now started to shake Lebanon politically and in the public sphere. So far, not militarily, fortunately, but it's not a very comfortable situation, obviously, because the whole region is shaking. Now, I'll say a final point. Anyone of you who was in New Jersey in March, I don't know, one family I think maybe may have been there or not. In a lecture about Lebanon, I said, Lebanon is a question. Lebanon is not an answer. Lebanon is a question. How do you balance yourself vis-a-vis the other groups? Lebanon is a question. For example, since my childhood in Lebanon, I remember reading in the newspapers a sentence that says, هل لبنان وطن نهائي? Is Lebanon a final nation, a final homeland? Now, why should you ask, is this final homeland? I mean, a German wouldn't say, is Germany a final homeland for me? Why are you asking the question? Well, they're asking because Lebanon is itself a question of all these balances of history, of religion, of ethnicity, of races, and so on. And I know that there is an Armenian interest in this Armenian Institute. I think one of the reasons why the Armenians felt very much at home in Lebanon, especially the majority that came in after the Armenian genocide and the deportations, was because the Armenians who came to Lebanon, they joined a nation that was asking the question for itself. So now you had another group who was to search for the answer, yet another group. So, and that was the comfort zone for the Armenians, maybe not for too long, but they kept asking the question. I mean, people who moved to the USA with the American dream, they didn't come to America saying, is America, you know, like those who were emigrating from their countries coming here, is America a final homeland and so on? Oops, where would you go? I mean, keep going west and so on. Now next you'll all go to China. You'll end up back in Lebanon, or I don't know where you will end up. So is the USA the final homeland for me? You know, I'm a theologian and I'm an ordained minister as well. I mean, this is not the topic. that's the definition of heaven, actually. You know, for us, it's not a definition of earth. But so that's the particularity, the strength and the weakness of Lebanon. Okay, now that's too many points there. I'll stop. Thank you.
No, I'm curious. I want to follow up, particularly given your answer to the first question I posed, which is thinking about definitions of minorities. So given that Lebanon, as you said rightly, is a country of, there is no majority, right? You have, unless one wanted to say, just count Christians perhaps, or Muslims, but since that's not the way that the system there is structured, it probably doesn't make sense to think of it in those terms. You talked about, and I think this is an important insight, that that part of a definition of minority is the psychology. Okay? So, with that in mind, thinking about the spectrum or the whole mashhad of these various sects or confessional groups in Lebanon, would you suggest that all of them have a self-perception of minority, or if not, which ones, and where do the Armenians fit into that?
Yeah. In the past 2 years, I've been thinking a lot, reading a lot about what's happening. I've been writing very little, intentionally. Some of you may have read something I wrote on silence. It's a one-page essay, Our Times of Silence. And then I said, oops, I'm talking about silence when I'm speaking, right? You said something, but how long could you be silent? So I wrote this one page and oops, cut it short there. But one of the things I've been noticing is that more and more groups are behaving and feeling like minorities. I'll give a couple of examples in the whole Middle East. One of the things that we're hearing from the Sunni Arabs, from Morocco to Saudi Arabia, is that they are oppressed by a growing Shia influence in the region. Now, numerically speaking, did you hear what I said? Morocco to Saudi Arabia? That's more than minority of minorities and it's more than majority of majorities. Then that's the psychology. It's the feeling that, wait a minute now, some things are shifting in the region. Powers are shifting. So what are we to do? It's not a matter of numbers at all. They have the governments, they have the leadership, they're the presidents and the kings, and they have the oil and the money and the influence and the fame. But it's the feeling. Another group that I can mention in Lebanon, Lebanese example. The Druze community never defined itself as a minority in Lebanon. In fact, with the Maronites, those who know Lebanese history, the Maronites, Christians, and this Druze sect, more Muslim, closer to the Muslim religion, let's say, they were the ones who ruled Mount Lebanon for ages. Now, in the past 1 year or two, when you hear the leadership of the Druze community talk about their situation, it's more and more, we're in a corner, who are we, how many are we, we're a minority. I had never read this in the way that I'm reading now. I don't think we have time to analyze why this is so, why almost everyone feels that they are an oppressed minority in the Middle East nowadays. And I don't want to jump into easy Western conclusions saying, well, give them freedom and they will choose their system and so on. No. I mean, that's not my idea of solving the situation of the Middle East. The easy Western slogans are good for the students of political science if they're here. It's good for now, till you challenge it later on. But really, I mean, why are all those who have all the numbers and the votes and get the votes and so on still feeling this? So there are other issues.
Yeah, interesting. I was thinking in preparing to come to speak with you today, that the events that initially were called the Arab Spring and now we call Arab uprisings or Arab autumn to Arab winter have significantly affected the lay of the land, and in some cases actually given rise to the possibilities of new groups for new groups to express themselves, to demand recognition. I think in particular in North Africa, we take a look at Libya, the Amazigh, which is otherwise known as the Berbers, are demanding that their culture be acknowledged in any future Libyan political system going forward. On the other hand, what was to me one of the most disturbing developments of the early, just the last year or so, these Arab uprisings, was the move on the part of the Egyptian government and associated media and so on after the removal of President Morsi a year and several months ago, to begin referring to anyone who was associated with the Muslim Brotherhood as if they were not part of us. You are not. There was this terrible video that came out. You are not of our people. You are not of our religion, and it was dreadful. So clearly, these forces that have unleashed the Arab revolutions and then have pushed well beyond what the initial expectations of all of us, I think, were, have led to all kinds of rethinkings of identities and so on. So with that as kind of backdrop, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on the current situation. I mean, we can start with Syria, we can start with Iraq. Again, thinking about the place of minorities, new minorities, threats, the possible disappearance, wherever you'd like to take it.
Yeah, I've been very concerned in the past 2 years. I've been very concerned in the past few months. 3 years ago, when these things started, I spoke at a conference organized by an Egyptian Christian group. Most of the speakers were Muslims. And they tried to see the Arab Spring as something very positive. And in fact, they were so excited about this. And then, following that excitement, there were elections. And then the Muslim Brotherhood won. When the Muslim Brotherhood won, suddenly all those who said democracy is good and voting is good and elections are very modern values of democracy, they changed their mind. They said, well, maybe it's not so good. And that was a dangerous thing, but I wasn't, honestly, and I don't want to say I told you so, but I wasn't surprised. In fact, the only preparation I had to do for this meeting with you today and with you was I reviewed 2 things I wrote. I spoke the Arabic. One was an Arabic text. I reviewed what I said in 2011. And the second one was in English. And in each one of them, I'm saying, well, democracy, or where this Arab Spring will lead us to, will depend on the value system of the public and the psychology of the public in these countries. Unfortunately, I always felt that the education of the people was not preparing them for any sort of election. So what you're saying is this. I mean, this is the right country to say this in America. Democracy is not your constitution. It's also your practice. It's also a value system. It's also a matter of citizenship. It's also a matter of respecting human life and respecting every person of every opinion. These values were not there, but then you suddenly had elections. We heard from various Western sources, American, European, when it was the Palestinian case, I'll give the Palestinian case, that we stand for free and fair elections and so on. And then in the Gaza district, they had elections. Who won? The more Islamist, Hamas and Islamist groups won. Suddenly the Western powers changed their mind about elections. They said, well, maybe this was not a good idea. But I thought democracy and elections and so on were the highest things to do. Apparently they weren't. Or there's double standards. And I think both are true. So, I mean, the people were not there. Before these problems happened, the Arab Spring issues, and since the Iraq War 10 years ago, 11 years, I don't know how long.
Which one? I mean, it's just
the one in
non-stop war.
I know, but one of those 10, 11 years, I was seeing a gradual move of the common people in Jordan and Syria and other countries into more and more Islamic fanaticism. And it was tied, they were tying it to an attack on something religious Islam, in Iraq, through Iraq, outside of Iraq, into Iraq, and so on. We were seeing a move among the common people into more fanaticism, less tolerance for the other, less acceptance of anyone else. I have no time to tell you about examples from villages in Syria, where I was hearing that people who spoke to their neighbors who were Christian and so on were not speaking to them anymore in small villages. I'm talking 2005, 6, 7, 8. So the sentiment of the public was going very radical religiously. And religious radicalism was being presented as a response to some sort of an attack from Western, whatever it was. Right or wrong, that was the move. So when there was time for people to speak more freely or to challenge their systems and governments, what erupted was these radical sentiments. So the people were ready to speak, but their hearts were not ready to accept. It was one thing to stand up before a camera or to go to a vote, cast a ballot and so on. But then you didn't have the right thinking about this. You weren't free. You had a vengeance and so on. So this describes what happened. So I honestly am not surprised. Now where I am surprised, well, I'm not surprised. Your media. I mean, not American only, global media. I'm sitting in Beirut. I live with the public in these countries, and I visit all these regions, and I'm in daily contact. I know what the sentiments are, and I know that the minute you allow this group, not this group, that group to move, they will do something wrong. I can tell it. Give them the chance and something wrong will happen, right? And then you turn on the Western media, and then you hear something like, just allow them to speak and express themselves, and people will decide what they want. You know what? I remember an aunt of mine, some of you may know. One day, she lived in Germany. One day she said to me, what if 51% of the country goes crazy? Crazy. They lose it. Someone drugs them. What do you say? What's your value? Is it the result of that election and you say this is what they want? Some people, as you know, are under influences, various influences. Let's now take the negative influences. Grudges, a very negative sense of identity, negative sense of the other, negative sense of history, repeated injustices, or perceptions of injustices, because I don't want to judge anyone. Perceptions. I mean, maybe no one was unjust against you, but you have a perception they were unjust. If this is where, you know, how you think, how you breathe, then this is what the end result will be. So the surprise, no surprise, was that the whole world is hearing on the news all these wonderful things and politicizing what is happening. Talking only about regimes and not talking about the real sentiments of the people and the problems of the people, and sometimes the wrong direction of the people, of the masses in certain towns and villages. For many years, small groups, small cells were developing new ideologies that are so fanatical, and people were not paying attention to them. They knew they were there, not paying attention. Now these groups have grown into Daesh and other things. I should also end by saying that the recent responses against these negative movements, the radical, cruel movements, the reaction now is not only inappropriate, I think it's giving the public in the world the wrong message. You know how many people have asked me whether these past bombings of the past 10 days are helping the minorities in the Middle East? If I repeat the question, I'll be ashamed. This is not a question. The question shows we have no idea how the world goes. The question is wrong. Honestly, allow me to also say that using force against these groups is the only way is also extremely simplistic. It is one of the ways which limits these groups on one street in one city. We're talking, friends, about the whole world, honestly, which is going crazy about not accepting the other. It's another lecture. Globalization and radicalization. Globalization and these reactions, negative reactions. I don't want to go there now. Mm-hmm. But it's not unrelated. I mean, the issue is so large in the world. That's why I will not be surprised with people who in Europe, let's say, or other places, who will emulate, who will take negative examples of what's happening in these Middle East regions. It has created a situation for most of the minorities in the Middle East, if not all, have created this situation has created an uncomfortable, terrifying condition that the region has not seen, I think, since World War I. 100 years ago, people were shifting and moving, they were dying and slaughtering each other and being deported and denied their identities. And they didn't know what was happening. It took them 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. For the Armenian, it's still 100 years and Armenians are figuring out what happened 100 years ago. The balance is not in the right place. That's in new ways, in even more radical ways, wider ways. It's being repeated on every local scene in the Middle East. And I think it will be more than the Middle East. I hope I'm not scaring you, but...
No, I think what we've been watching over the last several months has been certainly scary enough, and certainly should lead people to be asking these questions. And I want to personally thank you for the comment about the current response to what's going on, because I share your view that this is not a way to solve this. We seem to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different outcome, and we end up creating that which we thought we were responding to in the first place, which only becomes worse and on a much larger scale. Since you're an educator, among other things, one wants to find some way, some sort of set of strategies for dealing with this. How do we go forward? I mean, it's very difficult when we're watching, bombing and military campaigns and so on, to think about what could come later. But what do you see as the role of educational institutions in addressing these issues? Obviously, they're not operating in most parts of Syria and probably not very effectively in most parts of Iraq these days. But if we have to put our faith in something going forward, what do you see as the role of educational institutions? Of course, in the Middle East, we have a huge governmental sector which has been gradually depleted of resources. That people aren't getting the training they need. Teachers aren't paid what they should be paid. We have some fine private institutions in the Middle East. Maybe they've played a better role or have the potential for playing more role. What do you see?
I think education has a major role to play, but I'm even scared to use the word educational institutions now, because there are lots of educational institutions that are breeding all the negatives, creating more hatred, creating more animosity, defining life in its narrowest possible way. That's education. We have lots of universities and colleges and schools for children in many parts of the world, where the values, and we have to go back to values, where the values are based on the wrong of the other. They're not based on the good from which I start. So obviously, if education is based on the right values, of the minimum, like respecting human life in all its forms, of respecting people as persons, of having an open ear, an open eye, I'm talking childish things, right? But actually, educational institutions may fail to base themselves on these values. And if they fail in these, then no education, no PhD, and no BA, and no baccalaureate in Lebanon accomplishes anything. Now, almost every day when I'm in Beirut, all we have is 5 buildings, 900 students at our university. I spend between half an hour and 1 hour with the students in the street. Those of you who know Mexico Street, I'm just there, and I'm speaking to the students, and I see a sign of hope. I see a sign of hope because we're telling them, and we're doing something good and something that's not sufficient at Haigazian University. We tell our students, Haigazian University is not based on the same value system of the streets of the Middle Eastern societies. This is good on the one hand, because we're telling them, if your sect, if your race says the other one is your enemy, the other one is not to be respected, the other one is to be killed, we're telling you we respect each other here, irrespective of everything. So we're telling them, this is what we are, and we're different. We're going to base our experience these 4 years on something totally different. And those of you who know, and I know some of the people here are graduates of Haigazian, we succeed in this much. Where we do not succeed is that, okay, boy, when these people go out, they are a few people. They don't repeat what they learned, not always, at least, in the street, in the market. All the identities of these groups, of the majority of the groups in the Middle East, are based on some memory of an injustice. That's the basis. How different are you? There are not enough unifying factors, unifying values. Now, education has to create that space to find the common values, the least common denominators of values, the least of them. And the ones I mentioned are among the least and among the most basic, I guess. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we try. And I'm sure we succeed. And we have very good stories. Our students rarely have problems. They come from all sorts of, we have people of every Lebanese sect on a small campus. We rarely have problems. But I don't want to be naive. When they leave campus, when they graduate, how much of it is repeated elsewhere in their experience. So we're failing in that one, and I don't blame ourselves. We're trying our best. Eventually, I think we have to start with each person. I mean, I'm not here to say, and in education, as you know, in the class, we don't take a whole class. We don't take class, give me your opinion on this particular issue. You ask them to write papers. You ask them a question, each one responds by their answer. Why? Because you want to accompany each student on their journey of growth and openness and so on. So we try to teach these basic values, and some of these, in our case, our values at our university are based on the basic principles of Christianity, even though 50% of our students are Muslims. Mm-hmm. And to your surprise, I hope you will not be surprised, I rarely find any Muslim student who has a problem on our campus with the basic Christian values. If you know how to present them in the right way, it's not like, rejecting the other. It is trying to love the other, to serve the other, based on your own faith system and your own values. Now, unfortunately, these sound so foreign today to the current Middle East situation. It's gone beyond every limit, as you said. I mean, the graphic pictures, they're not exaggerated, by the way. Some people have asked me, is what we're seeing or hearing exaggerated now in Syria and Iraq? It's not exaggerated. Yeah, but education is hope. Education is on condition it is based on the proper values.
Okay, well, I think Salpi had said we might have time for a couple of questions. I don't know where she is, but I'll... Okay, so I'll take maybe... Yes, please. If you could stand up when you ask your question. So,
my name is Simon Simonian. Thank you for a very thorough discussion and educating us, updating us about details. Now, as you said, the bombing is not right. The bombing is not right, in your opinion. And now there's the training of the rebels in Saudi Arabia to oust President Bashar al-Assad. In your opinion, who is going to take over? Who is better than the current president to rule Syria? This is our typical Middle Eastern policy, as has been mentioned over the past decade or more.
Yeah. About bombings and so on, the recent response, I understand that there had to be some response. I mean, people would have blamed their governments had they not done anything. And we are an audiovisual generation. So we like to see maps and bombs hitting and, like spots. And I mean, we like these. We play these games. And I think the public expects the same about politics. Politics is not an audiovisual game. I think the bombings are... I was thinking of saying that bombings may treat some of the symptoms, but I don't even think it would do that. The bombings will change some of the military operations and the map of some of the military operations. That's it. Now, who's training whom and so on? Unfortunately, the whole discussion of the Middle East is not about human beings and the people. It's about interests. It's about who likes whom, who wants to rule where, who has what interest. Every single country that calls itself a dictatorship or a democracy is interested in its own local and its own global interests. The USA or any other country does that. I think I stand here and everything I represent has to do with life and human being and people and populations. The trainings you talk about, toppling a government, changing a president, these are symptoms. I will not have a candidate for any country. I don't care who runs which country. People have to have the right space to create, to live, to keep their identity, to preserve the values, to serve each other, to look for a better future, to develop human civilization, the fullness of life, if you like. That's what I care about. Now, one country trains a group here to oppose that. Qatar supports one of the Islamist groups, Saudi another, Jordan a third one, Turkey a fourth one, and so on. These are, for me, these are immaterial. I think everyone is wrong. They're all doing the wrong. I don't see a right group in this. Yeah, I speak for life, for the people. And now, which president is good, which year, which king is good, which year, for what purpose, is immaterial to me. I mean, let's take a distance from these issues. These political issues, when politicians or the media present figures as heroes. I know that in America, it's very common to say, who are our allies is a big thing. Who are our friends? I think this is an extremely temporary, irrelevant discussion. That's not how life is constructed. That's not how relationships and interests are constructed. These change up and down. We eventually, and let me go back to what I said in that Egyptian conference I was talking about in 2011. I said, don't tell me about an Arab Spring. In 5 years' time, if I review the laws and the constitution and the practice of Egypt, will I see that people are more comfortable economically, in their families, in their value systems, in reconstructing their churches, in expressing their opinions, in being human beings, getting their rights, whether Muslim or Christian or Jewish. That's more interesting. I think that's, and unfortunately, all of us get distracted with these superficial discussions of who is an ally, which country is this, which is doing that, and so on. Yeah, so it's like we feel like toys, don't we? We feel like toys. We're being fed by some information, partial information, right or wrong representation of what happens there. Yeah, I mean, as I said, and I'm so glad that this format is the way it is, because I would have not wanted to give a lecture about the Middle East to you. I live the Middle East every day. That's more important for you to hear from me than to hear a lecture about what a minority is and what politics is and so on. In fact, I was, not that I knew much, but from the Iraq war in Saddam Hussein, I said, if someone as simple and humble and limited as I knew this, how come the UN didn't know what I knew? How come the European Union didn't know? You know, how come the USA didn't know? Sarcastic question.
Okay, time maybe for one more question. Something, was there some? Well, actually, I think you had your hand up. You were the second one, so all right, I'll go this way. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haidostian, for your presentation. My question is, do you consider the Arab Spring as uprising or foreign intervention? Thank you.
Dr. Brand said I'm an educator. So I will say both and more. It is an uprising in the sense that many groups that couldn't speak before the Arab Spring, so-called, were able to express their opinion, represent their identities. So, let's be fair. It really gave some of the groups some more or some new space. This it did. It challenged the fact that once you rule a country, you could rule it forever. Okay, so these are good things that happen. Foreign intervention, absolutely, all over the place. Not only intervention, where one foreign power was interested in this country now and not interested in the other country then, interfered here and not there and so on. This is maximum foreign interference. The fact that the foreign media got excited about this, these uprisings and so on, already politicized it in a big way. Imagine, Al Jazeera television is right across the street from my office. As well, it's not as close as this tree, but 3 times farther. No, literally. I sit here, and Lebanon, the building of Al Jazeera is right there. Al Jazeera started with one perspective, shifted its perspective. Al Arabiya started with one perspective, shifted, and then suddenly the Arabs felt that there were some other opinions not being represented, so Al Mayadeen TV was started suddenly to present yet a third opinion about what was happening. And so, what is this? This is a political reality. Most of it is foreign interference. But as I said, it is both and more. Now, the more is that I think human civilization, I'm ashamed to say civilization, human societies are changing, sometimes to the better and often to the worse, as we're seeing. So I think that's a third one. Society is changing. And society is not always changing to the better. And in the Middle East, we're seeing the ugly face of the shift of mentalities. This Daesh issues. I couldn't believe that that there are regions in Lebanon where in the past few weeks you have demonstrations every day in support of ISIS or Daesh with their flags. I cannot accept this in Lebanon. You would have never imagined. The Muslim Sunnis were saying that no one in Lebanon will support such a thing. And now it's changing. What does this mean? So there's a whole societal change, change of perception, change of defining societal life and human life, often to the worse.
One last question. Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for your insightful comments and the time spent giving us information about the Middle East and in particular Lebanon. Is there at this point, in your estimation, a bit of Middle East fatigue, much like there is a bit of Africa fatigue? And this responsibility to protect, something which the UN has been discussing in relation to, if you will, a case study in Central African Republic, what's been going on in Syria and Jordan, going back to the beginnings of the Iraqi conflict, has shown so many people being displaced internally, so many refugees being victims of human trafficking, and you can go down the laundry list. But the responsibility to protect, how is that actually being manifested in this area? Because the humanitarian crisis has been going on for ever since there has been kinetic action.
Right, thank you. In fact, I thank you for using the word protect, because before coming here, I wanted to say something about it, and I would have missed it. So, I think what we are first to protect is every human being in the Middle East. I don't want to talk about protecting groups in the Middle East. I want to talk about protecting life, individual life, of every human being in the Middle East, no matter what country, what belonging, what religion, what, friends or not. What I have not enjoyed in the past year is the whole discussion also in the USA about protecting the Christian minorities in the Middle East. I myself have spoken in the US about Christian minorities, but I will not find protecting Christian minorities as an appropriate way of dealing with the situation. Protecting a minority means that you're creating a distance between the various groups of the Middle East. I live on a street, I live in a region, Haigazian University is in a region which is predominantly Muslim. If you come and protect me for 1 year at Haigazian, what am I going to do the second year? Protection is not a sustainable reality. I will be more protected if I find better ways of living with those around me, those Muslims and those Druze. So the whole discussion of protecting minorities has to be shifted to protecting human life and the human individual. If every human being is protected in the Middle East, every minority will be more than safe. The same I would say about Africa. It's not protecting one tribe versus the other, or one regime versus its opposition, but to change society and governmental policies and the support for development in Africa in such a way that eventually every human being is to benefit. Every policy that benefits the welfare of every human being, to grow, to work, to develop, to create, to be free. I think these are the right values. I'm very uncomfortable every time I hear about a conference to protect the Christian minorities of the Middle East, because that's so limited, short-sighted, and it's not sustainable at all.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the time. Thank you for a great conversation. Thanks for your speech.
Thank you on behalf of all of us for many things. Thank you, Dr. Brand. Thank you, Dr. Haidostian. Come back next month. We'll let you all know.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Thanks.